Welcome everyone to our third public seminar in the course Political Participation, a research dialogue with leading international scholars. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm an associate professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on participation and representation in the digital age. And I'm very honored to introduce our third speaker in this series, Professor Theda Skocpol of Harvard University. Theda is one of the most widely influential scholars in the modern social sciences, and she is also active in public efforts, including the organization she founded and directs called the Scholar Strategy Network. Theda's talk today is based on a co-authored book chapter published in 2021 on the topic Community Organizing and Partisan Polarization, which we all know is clearly one of the most important research topics in the current era. Before turning to Theda's talk, a few notes on how we'll run this webinar. First, Theda will speak for about a half hour till the top of the hour. Second, I'll introduce our panelists who've carefully read Theda's chapter and have each prepared questions in advance. And third, we'll select questions that participants write to us in the chat for Theda's response. So during the talk, we welcome you to send your questions in the chat to any of us who are defined as co-hosts for the panelists' review. So thank you all for joining us. And Theda, the floor is yours.
It's a great honor to be here, and always a pleasure to see Jenny again and to see her students now. I can remember many wonderful times when we were working on research projects together, and I'm going to get this going. Some of which fed into the work that's here, but I guess it was an earlier generation that Jenny was directly involved in as kind of the foreperson of the research team. She was essential. So, all right. Okay, what I'm going to do is talk about the United States, but I hope to share an approach to thinking about citizen organizing in the current period that could be applied in Israel or in a lot of other countries. And if people want to ask those kinds of questions, I won't necessarily know about the specifics, but I'll be happy to comment on the approach. This is research that looks at waves of citizen organizing that have unfolded over the last 10 to 15 years in the United States. So in the digital age, and they all make use of one or another form of digital as well as face-to-face organizing, depending on how far technology has advanced at the time that the movement unfolds. But I'm going to be asking about where they come from in a period where we had kind of assumed that United States citizens were not forming groups and participating as much as they did historically. That has been reversed in the recent years. I'm going to look at the Tea Party following the 2008 election. Then 8 years later, the anti-Trump resistance that formed after Donald Trump was first elected in 2016. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted across the country during the summer in which the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis was videoed for everybody to see. And even during the pandemic, mass protests erupted. What I want to do is try to understand the origin and forms of these waves of citizen organizing, and then how they grew out of and contributed to party polarization, which is an ongoing, ever more extreme process in the United States. So let me just start with a couple of quotes from the fieldwork interviews that I did about these movements. And even though they're 8 years apart, they're startlingly similar from different ends of the US political spectrum. In 2009, in the Tea Party era, after Barack Obama was elected president, a woman in Arizona, a husband and wife couple, actually organized a Tea Party there And this is a quote, I believe, from the wife. "We've always voted, but being busy people, we just couldn't keep as involved as maybe we should have. And now," meaning after Barack Obama was elected, "we're to the point where we were really worried about our country. I feel like we came out of retirement. We do Tea Party stuff to take the country back to where we think it should be." And then 8 years later, after an equally, in the eyes of partisans, controversial president was elected, Donald Trump, a woman who organized an anti-Trump grassroots resistance group in Wisconsin, just a little younger than the Tea Party years before her, told me, "I had always been a voter and donated to my party and some select candidates, but I had not been super involved. Then the presidential campaign in 2016 became more and more ridiculous and frightening, and our very worst nightmare happened. My life changed overnight. I was called to action. I feel like a soldier in a war trying to save this country, my children's future, the climate," and the list keeps growing. So that dramatizes, I think, the spurs to waves of citizen organizing at the grassroots in the United States and the existential stake that many of the people who became involved in these waves of organizing feel. I'll do a little bit of comparison of this Tea Party that grew from 2009 through 2011 and 12, and then later anti-Trump resistance starting right after Trump was elected in 2016 and peaking somewhere a couple, 2 to 3 years later, peaking in the sense of organizing at the grassroots. I'll talk a little bit about their emergence and scope, who leads and participates in them, the motives, we've already seen a bit of that, and just what the policy battles were and how we have to understand these fields of organizing from both top-down and bottom-up types of organizations. They're not single kinds of organizations, but many kind, and I'll end by talking about the impact on the political parties. So, the research strategy I want to stress is that my colleagues and I have used is a little different from what you'll often read in the mass media or a lot of other scholarly studies, where people focus only on national organizations that are formal organizations, advocacy organizations, well-funded, like the Indivisible Headquarters in 2016, Swing Left, Move On, Black Lives Matter has a focusing on the central leadership, or other kinds of organizations that have identified with the waves that I'm going to describe. We try to go well beyond that by investigating especially the local volunteer groups. That means going to a lot of unusual sources of evidence and actually going out into the country and talking to people. Try to understand how widespread Tea Party organizing was and how widespread local anti-Trump resistance groups, where they formed, who led them. So in 2011, back at the time of the Tea Party, along with a colleague that we later published a book, we did field visits and interviews with local Tea Party members and organizers in Virginia, Arizona, and New England. And we collected internet data on groups across the country that had websites, which they mainly had Facebook pages or meetup pages at that time. Then in the later movement against Donald Trump from 2017 to 19, I actually visited 8 pro-Trump counties, medium city counties and small town areas in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and collected and interviewed dozens of people in each of these sites. And then I collected online questionnaire responses. Now, those visits were to look at people across the spectrum, including surviving Tea Parties. But I also immediately noticed in all of these places, even though they were Trump country places, that there were anti-Trump resistance groups that had formed. And so I got to know them, visit them in some cases, and observe the meetings and interview the organizers. And in Pennsylvania, we actually were able to conduct online questionnaires with representatives of 80 different groups in 55 of the 67 counties across the vast and highly variegated state of Pennsylvania. So that's kind of some of the data that finally, more recently, my colleagues and I put together nationwide databases using all available sources to get a sense of the location of some 2,000 to 3,000 Tea Parties at the height of that movement and anti-Trump resistance groups. So we actually know not how many people are in each group, but where the groups were located. So let me just remind people a little bit about these movements. The Tea Party erupted within weeks after Barack Obama's inauguration as president of the United States in 2009, when a television commentator, Rick Santelli, called for people to engage in Tea Party protests. That's the idea, back to the American Revolution, of throwing tea into the sea against the British. To organize protests, but in this case, it was to be against the mortgage assistance policies of the Obama administration. Obama was trying to help people at the height of the economic recession. But after that rant, so-called, occurred on a finance program on TV. Fox News and right-wing talk media picked it up. Lots of right-wing websites picked it up, and it spread like wildfire among people who were already very conservative-minded and already very scared at the election of the first Black president of the United States. By April 15th of 2009, there were coordinated mass rallies on tax day in 542 counties across the United States. Other researchers put this data together out of news reports involving between 400,000 and 800,000 protesters. So you can see that this got going very quickly, and it was very important that it spread through right-wing media like wildfire. When I interviewed one man in Virginia a couple years later, he told me he'd heard about it right away on his car radio as he was driving around. The rallies were very colorful. They included mostly older white Americans dressed up as colonial protesters and carrying signs that denounced Barack Obama as both a communist and a fascist. There wasn't a great deal of subtlety or ideological positioning going on here, just anger and an attempt to attract media attention. The part of it that was more interesting to my colleagues and I is that some 2,000 to 2,500 regularly meeting local Tea Parties were formed from the spring to the summer of 2010 and persisted. 900 of them at least were still active by the spring of 2011, when Vanessa Williamson and I did our field interviews, and some of them are still meeting to this very day. So this was quite a wave of local organizing by volunteer groups across the country. The movement had resonances from the left and the center of the spectrum 8 years later, when Donald Trump was elected president. Equally shocking to people at the other end of the spectrum as Barack Obama's election had been to people on the right. And of course, once again, there was a combination of mass protests. This is a picture of a day after Donald Trump's inauguration in Washington, the Women's March. And there were women's marches joined by more than 4.2 million people in more than 600 US cities across the United States that followed on that same day or shortly after that massive Women's March in Washington. So it wasn't just something happening in the Capitol, it was all over the country, just like the Tea Party protests had been. And just as in the case of the Tea Parties, we know from the website Indivisible, that was set up as a sort of clearinghouse for information, that almost 6,000 local entities soon spread across the United States. Research later showed that about 4,600 of those 6,000 listings on the Indivisible website were still there a couple of years later, and about 2,000 of them, I would estimate, were probably actual local groups that met. They had a web presence, but they also met face to face. And you can see that, like the Tea Parties, they were spread all over the country. In fact, in states where we were able to do an even more rigorous accounting of where groups were, you can see that both Tea Parties and resistance groups, Tea Parties in red, resistance groups in blue and purple, meaning both in a particular county, that they're all over the place. So that means that this wave of citizen organizing, although it was spurred from the right or the left, created regularly meeting groups, even in places where the partisans were a tiny minority. For example, that Pennsylvania map there, the purple areas, many of those are counties that are quite conservative and always have been. And yet, when I visited some of them in the spring of 2017, I found groups of people who had organized anti-Trump resistance groups. And the same thing was true in North Carolina and every other state I visited. Now, let me just talk a little bit about what we know about how the grassroots groups were formed, focusing especially on the anti-Trump resistance groups in 2016, 17, 18, but also making comparisons to the Tea Parties. I wish I could get rid of this thing at the bottom of the, all right, I'm gonna get rid of it. All right. So grassroots groups were usually formed by 2 to 5 kind of initiators, mostly women. They met in many cases after the 2016 election. They may not have already known each other. Sometimes friends did this, but other times it was people who met on the bus to the March on Washington or to a regional march. The founding meetings were usually held in local restaurants or libraries, and they were announced electronically and through friendship networks. They met regularly after that, usually monthly, sometimes weekly at first, and used websites like Facebook and the Pantsuit Nation kind of regional and local contact finders that website that had been created in anticipation of Hillary Clinton's election after she lost. They formed a site for sites that were more locally focused so people could connect. Most of the groups took tactical advice from the online Indivisible guide that was put out by some Washington staffers, but the efforts were genuinely local and therefore highly varied. They were all up and running by the spring of 2017. They had their own leaders, plans, projects, Facebook pages, and often periodic newsletters. This is very similar to what happened in the Tea Party after Barack Obama was elected. It was people sometimes who met each other. In one case, a man read an op-ed that another person had written in a local paper and searched her out, and they together worked with the meetup technology at the time to advertise a group, and then people descended upon the library or the church basement. Usually it was one or the other for tea parties. And they set themselves up to meet regularly, made use of Meetup in particular, and sometimes Facebook pages, as well as person-to-person contacts. So, yeah, why is this not working now suddenly? Okay. So as I pointed out, even the most conservative counties after Trump was elected had these indivisible groups, and here are pictures of them at their meetings. The one in Ohio, Licking County, conservative area, that's in the basement of a liberal church. In Monroe County, Wisconsin, that's a doctor speaking to a group of people. And the one up on top is in a library meeting room. Who were they? The grassroots resistance organizers against Trump were overwhelmingly white, older women. There were men, sometimes in leadership, often in the membership, but they were usually the male partners of the women who were the organizers or their long-term friends. 80 to 90% of the resistance organizers were college educated, and many had advanced degrees. They tended to work as teachers, librarians, professors, healthcare providers, or business or nonprofit managers. Most were identified as Democrats or lean Democrat, but in the resistance against Trump from the beginning, there were independents and disgruntled Republicans. If we flash back to the Tea Party, it's another story of white, older, middle-class Americans who were the organizers, the initiators, And they tended to be both men and women, but women are often the organizers, even in a male-dominated group. Most of the couch potatoes of the Tea Party movement were men, often the spouses, again, of women, but women were often the ones who did the actual organizing. They were far-right Republicans. They were in business, in industries like construction or various small businesses, and a lot of them were retirees. These upsurges at 8 years apart were born of fierce anger and fear at the election of what was considered to be a shocking president to the partisans who organized. It was especially upsetting because something unusual had happened, at least it was unusual at that point in US history, which was that two houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, had been elected from the same party. So there was a fear that the controversial new president, the Black president with an immigrant father, with a foreign father in the case of Obama, or the often considered corrupt businessman and TV show guy in Donald Trump, it was a lot of fear that they would be able to make sudden changes quickly, and that was a spark that aroused organizing. To Tea Partiers, Barack Obama symbolized un-Americanness. In the interviews I did, given that I'm a Harvard College professor that people talk to, they would not come out and say openly racist things. Only against Muslims would they say openly racist things. They would not say openly racist things against a Black man, but they would say things like, he's not what he seems to be. It was also upsetting to them that not only that he was Black, but that he was a former community organizer and had a foreign father, if anything, and that he was a Democrat and that he was a college professor. It was like the perfect storm from their point of view. And for resistors, Donald Trump was seen as someone who lacked character, qualifications, who showed open disrespect to women, minorities, and immigrants, and displayed a selfish disregard for the public good. We were able to do a survey among resistance people across the state of Pennsylvania, and we included some from other places. And the reasons that they gave for getting involved in the grassroots resistance, sometimes in places where they would risk losing their job for doing this, was opposition to Trump for sure, but look at the other reasons: saving or improving the country, finding community with like-minded others. That was especially important to people in very conservative places. So the motives were not mainly electoral. They more had to do with getting active in public affairs and saving or improving the country. That theme of saving the country, very, very important. I'll move through this quickly. The local groups tended to do remarkably parallel things in the two movements. They met regularly. They usually, Tea Party groups more frequently had outside speakers, but both kinds of groups could do so. They would organize to attend protests. Tea Party meetings usually started with a pledge of allegiance to the US flag, and usually with a prayer that might or might not feature Jesus. And that could be a big argument in the group because there were Russian Jews who were members of some of these groups, and they didn't like if the prayers mentioned Jesus. Resistance groups are like college groups. They don't bother with any pledge of allegiance or prayers. They just chit-chat for a while and then jump into it with committee reports and task force reports. But both groups, would focus on organizing further protests, on outreach into the community, on contacting legislative offices at all levels. And resistance groups were, in my observations, somewhat more likely to ally with other groups, like, since these were white women liberals, they tended to think that they should openly ally with Black groups or immigrant groups in order to build some diversity into their activities. Tea Party groups were very self-enclosed and very suspicious, even sometimes of other Tea Party groups. Both groups spent their first year fighting over Obamacare, whether it would be enacted in the first place, the health care law, or whether it would be repealed. They had an impact in both cases. The wave of protests following Obama's election almost prevented Obamacare from being enacted and helped to make it unpopular for some years. At the end of this graph, where opinion turns toward more favorable toward the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, it was partly because of all this grassroots organizing at a time when repeal was threatened during the first year of Trump's presidency. I just want to stress that both of these grassroots waves were parts of larger movements that had top-down as well as bottom-up parts. And that's a very crucial part of our research. We saw that the Tea Party was these thousands of grassroots groups, but it was also longstanding ultra-free market right-wing advocacy groups whose leaders put themselves on TV and often claimed that the grassroots protests were about cutting public spending. But our research showed that local Tea Partiers were usually angry about immigration and fearful about social and cultural and generational change in the country, and that most of the local Tea Partiers were on Social Security and Medicare, which are the big sources of public spending in the United States. So they were angry about Obamacare, which would be about lower income people, healthcare, but they certainly were not about cutting public spending overall. And in the resistance movement 8 years later, there was a similar set of tensions between top-down groups that were usually young professionals located in Washington, D.C. or New York City, and then the mainly older women who could be their mothers or grandmothers, and sometimes were, who were the chief grassroots organizers. And the tensions there usually had to do with how far do you go in pushing left progressive causes and in opposing Democratic leaders if they compromised. The center of gravity at the grassroots in the resistance was with more moderate liberals. The center of gravity at the grassroots in the Tea Party was with very ethno-nationalist oriented, anti-immigrant populist groups. They both ended up encouraging surges of new candidacies in the next midterm elections for the House of Representatives. Those peaked on the right in 2010 and in 2018 on the left. And in the case of the resistance, a lot of women ran for office who were in these resistance groups or backed by them. And that greatly increased the share of Democratic women at all levels of government in the United States. Let me just wrap up by saying the impact on the party and governing agendas was different in these two cases. They both had an impact in kind of revving up voters and helping to move the partisan outcomes of elections, starting with the next elections for Congress, away from the controversial president that each movement was protesting. But the impact of the Tea Party kind of melded over the years into Trumpism. Tea parties were very disorganized, but Trump provided a focus by 2015. And in 2013 and 14, many Tea Party people had an impact on the House of Representatives, particularly in the United States, and interjected a style of no compromise, angry politics, tweeting by then, that has made it hard to arrive at any compromises about anything when Republicans control parts or all of Congress. And in particular, grassroots anger has prevented comprehensive immigration reform in the United States to the present day, and has helped to make it impossible for that issue to be in any way addressed in a nonpartisan or transpartisan way. The resistance did not have that kind of extremist impact on the Democratic Party. It expanded the Democratic Party's presence into counties where it would lose, but lose less badly. But on the other hand, it has arguably increased generational tensions in the Democratic Party, and those tensions persist and have now been transferred to new issues like what's going on in Israel and Gaza now. This chart from the article that I think people have read kind of documents this using our quantitative data. We show that grassroots resistance groups were everywhere, but were most per capita in the swing areas that flipped states toward moderate Democrats in 2018, whereas Tea Party's work concentrated in the most conservative Republican areas. And those are the same areas that are hotbeds of Trumpism in more recent years. I just want to end by saying a little bit about the final wave of nationwide organizing that the United States has recently seen. In the summer of 2020, even though it was the height of the pandemic and most of the older people who had organized tea parties or resistance groups were at home and not going out, a wave of protests led by younger Americans swept across the United States in just as many, even more places, following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis. We know that more than 600 places, once again, including places that had no African Americans. So this was a multi-age and a multi-ethnic and multiracial wave of protests in the Black Lives Matters protests of the summer of 2020. Initially, and we know data that's been collected on marchers throughout the recent years shows that only the racial protests, particularly the George Floyd protests, had young people. Other protests in recent years, even if they've been about issues that are supposedly of interest to young people, have been mainly these older white men and women. At the height of the protest, these nationwide protest movements seem to move public opinion in the direction of criticizing police brutality and sympathy to Black Lives Matter as a movement across the board, across partisan divides and age divides. But by the end of that summer, which was leading into the 2020 presidential election, partisan and racial divides had reemerged. White Republicans in particular swung against many of the Black Lives Matter and police reform issues by the end of the summer, whereas white liberals in the Democratic Party and blacks across the board have remained sympathetic. So this was a transpartisan movement more than the other two at its height, but it fell into partisan lanes very quickly. The most controversial issue was the radical slogan that started in Minneapolis, championed, I would say, mainly by white people who did not live in Minneapolis, and spread among progressives. That was the slogan, defund the police, which is immediately rejected by Democratic candidates and elected officials. And frankly, as research later showed, also rejected by many blue-collar minority residents of the areas where the brutality incidents had actually occurred. So let me just sum up and open the door for discussion. What I've tried to show here very quickly is that both the Tea Party and the resistance involved widespread upsurges in popular civic and electoral mobilization. In fact, the first great waves of voluntary citizen organizing that has happened in quite some time in the United States, because in the late 20th century, the tendency was for professionally run advocacy groups to become more prominent, especially nationwide. Those two waves grew out of party polarization, certainly. The shock of partisans on the other end of the spectrum at the election of a president backed by two houses of Congress. But they ended up, of course, further feeding the partisan polarization, which continues in the United States to this day. And as I explained before, the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests were transpartisan at first, given the almost universal shock at the brutality that was shown on the videos out of Minneapolis. But they soon fell back into a partisan divide as a presidential contest, President Trump's reelection bid emerged. Both parties were boosted by these movements. I would argue that they were boosted in terms of regular activism, more people active, and the United States has recently seen the highest levels of voter turnout, which are still paltry by international standards, but the highest standards of voter turnout in 100 years, because people on both ends of the spectrum, partly organized by these citizen movements, have been voting and voting up and down the ballot, not just for national elections. Trumpism has deepened on the right. It has literally transformed. It has picked up where the Tea Party protests left off and literally transformed the Republican Party into a more and more authoritarian-leaning ethno-nationalist party, which is no longer particularly interested in majority democracy and willing to use even threats of violence to compromise elections or reverse them. Democrats have also been remade by the new waves of activism, and Democratic activists see existential stakes just like Trumpists do. Everybody in America thinks America is about to come to an end if the other side wins. But there are racial and generational disconnects evident in the resistance, Black Lives Matter, and now increasingly to generationally different reactions to the ongoing events in Israel and Gaza and the Middle East in general. So both parties have been boosted and pushed, but tensions have played out. I would argue more to a resolution on the right than on the center left, but they're there on both ends. So let me stop now and do I stop sharing my screen so that I can hear the questions that the commentators have prepared and open the floor for discussion.
Thanks for this, Theda. Your talk really brings to life how these groups both can make a difference, can have an impact on policy, and then have all these unexpected consequences. You know, your chapter also reviews it, but you really brought it to life even further with the more recent update since the chapter wrapped up. So I'll introduce our three panelists who'll ask their questions one after the next, and then we'll hear Theda's response to these questions. A reminder to everyone, we've already received a few questions in the chat. You're welcome now to send to the co-hosts any questions you'd like to be considered for the Q&A for the second round, if you haven't already. So our first question is from Dr. Yael Kaplan. She's a postdoctoral researcher at Haifa University and an auditor of our course. Yael.
Thank you, Theda. This was very interesting. And my question kind of relates to what you started talking about at the end, but I will ask it anyway, because one of your central findings is that the organizational fields, your study led to extremism on the right, but not so much on the left. Now, at the end of your presentation, you talked about how it did affect both sides, but I'm still under the impression that it was more for the Republican or the Tea parties than to the other side. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about what you think this finding published in 2021 and based on your earlier research, whether it is still true today, considering stronger voices that have become anti-Biden in the progressive left in the US.
Yep.
Thanks, Yael. Next, we have a question from Eilat Etgar. She's a first-year PhD student in our department. Eilat.
Hi. So in your chapter, you highlighted the work of several internet facilitating means used to recruit people on the left, especially women, as you elaborated now in this talk. And you described the online organization Swing Left in 2018 as uniquely impactful. So I'm curious if you could discuss why you think this kind of group was so impactful and whether your explanation can help give insights for how to build this type of impactful resistance organizations. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Eilat. Our final panelist question is from Yam Bahar, a second-year BA student in our department.
The chapter notes that both of the prominent movements that you write about, the Tea Party and the anti-Trump movement, were mostly middle-class whites promoting clashing visions. How do you think the relatively low historical widespread effective involvement of people of color and paternalism towards them in these kind of groups may affect how much they trust in their ability to be effective through American political structures?
Okay, Theda, super easy questions. Go for it.
Okay, so let me just tackle them in reverse order. The two movements that created these nationwide kind of local voluntary group waves were white middle class led, with a heavy component of women, heavier on the resistance side. But that does not mean that Black Americans, in particular African Americans, have not been organized. I would argue that in the anti-Trump movement, African Americans were already organized in many ways through church networks, particularly, and these are women-led networks as well. If we go to the state of Alabama, for example, where one of the first kind of reactions to the Trump presidency was the surprise election of, I'm forgetting the senator's name, but a Democratic senator who had been active in the civil rights movement was elected over, admittedly a kind of probably a child predator that was run on the right, but nevertheless, a very conservative. Alabama is one of the most conservative states in the United States, and that was a coalition of Black-led, women-led church networks that also got their youngsters out, that had been there for a long time in the core areas of Alabama, cities and rural areas, with indivisible resistance groups in the kind of major cities led by the white women that I've discussed. So we shouldn't conclude that particularly African Americans were inactive in the anti-Trump period or now. It's just that their networks and their organizations are not the same ones. On the right, they're all older whites. I mean, there are occasional Black preachers that are conservative minded, or Black professors that are conservative minded. And I always found that the Tea Parties were thrilled if one of them would come to speak. There were, as I said, Russian Jewish immigrants were sometimes members of the Tea Parties, but no other immigrants. And immigrants tend not to be active as much on either side of the spectrum. And all right, so swing left. Swing left is interesting. I think you have to understand that it was part of this universe of resistance groups that I've described. It was unique, and then it was more internet focused, and it was more about mobilizing money from a place like Massachusetts to channel it into elections in swing areas. Massachusetts, as you may know, is all Democrats. I mean, it's not all Democrats. We have Republicans in Massachusetts, but they don't win very much. So organizing people to give money in Massachusetts elections is really a waste of time if you want to defeat Republicans or Donald Trump. So what Swing Left did was to work sometimes explicitly with these grassroots groups that I've described, sometimes just through internet contacts, to give people a way to send money or to volunteer and travel to a swing district in a state like Ohio or Pennsylvania. Now, is this generalizable to other movements? I think all movements are conglomerates of different kinds of groups. And a lot of times the groups that are part of them cooperate to address different challenges that overlap but aren't exactly the same. So that's an example of that. But this is unique to the US political system because, we have a federated political system in which people tend to live in areas with co-partisans. And so what was so remarkable about both the resistance and the Tea Parties was that they organized everywhere, even in territories where they were a minority. But when it comes to contesting elections, the Democrats in particular face the challenge of building leverage in areas where they are not necessarily an automatic majority. And that was particularly something that Swing Left's organizers were very aware of. And so they provided a means to do that. I hope that makes sense. Extremism. I think, as I suggested, tensions between top down and bottom up tended to play out in both of these movements. And on the Democratic or center-left side of the resistance, the tensions were between more variegated and often more moderate-minded liberals at the grassroots. Let's face it, if you're organizing a grassroots group to resist Donald Trump in a place like North Carolina, Western North Carolina, this is where people lost their jobs when they were identified in the media as organizers. So they tended, for example, to oppose abortion policies by talking about, or to oppose the repeal of Obamacare by arguing that healthcare is pro-life. They were adapting their message to their setting. And not very many of those grassroots groups imagined that if you ran, Ocasio-Cortez in your district, that you were going to do as well as if you ran a moderate Democrat of some kind. On the other hand, the youngsters in Washington, D.C. thought that, like most college graduates in the United States now do, that we should be pure, that everything should be pure leftism. So that was the tension that existed. And the people in Washington wanted to run more progressive Democrats to challenge moderate Democrats. The people at the grassroots and the resistance were never very enthusiastic about that, and real schisms could occur about that. But the bottom line is that even now, and you're going to read endless coverage about the 19% who voted uncommitted in Minneapolis, remain calm. They voted uncommitted. They didn't vote for, some firebrand person who said that the United States should break all relations with Israel. That's not what happened. It's a protest, all right, but it's a protest of the kind that, moves the needle slightly toward more aid for being dropped from airplanes into Gaza. It's not the same kind of thing as is happening on the right in the United States, where there doesn't seem to be any limit to the amount of rejection of compromise and movement toward more and more pure extreme blow it all up type candidates that can emerge. So that's what I'm talking about. Did these movements, spark certain divides? Of course. And can they be mapped onto more or less extreme versions of left or right politics? Yes, they can. But the center of gravity was and remains with moderate liberal Democrats in the United States. And it is becoming more and more, with no limit in sight, extreme authoritarian ethno-nationalists on the right in the United States.
It's interesting to hear your comments on that. We discussed exactly that case of the uncommitted in our class this week, and had exactly that question of, is it perhaps that the left is moving in the direction that you described? So it's excellent to hear your
the uncommitted
research-based
vote in
insights on
Michigan
this.
and Minneapolis includes many Muslim or Arab Americans who are understandably upset about the death toll. There's no question about it. And some of the politicians appealing to them are saying, we'll never vote for Biden again. But that is a distinct minority. And in fact, the people who encourage these uncommitted votes are looking for a way to express extreme concern on the humanitarian issues without abandoning Biden for the fall. So I expect to see about a 3/4 to 1/4 split when we get to the fall.
Okay, we'll pay attention to that prediction and see where it goes. Great. Well, thanks. Everyone has been putting in great questions into the chat. We're ready now to proceed to a second round of questions. Unless Theda, did you want to add anything else in on the first round of questions? Okay.
No,
great.
they were excellent questions, and I've said what I can about them.
Yep. Excellent, thank you. Great, so we'll proceed in the same order as in the first round, and our first question will come in from Yael. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a question originally asked by Dr. Asaf Suberi. So the text describes the Republican Tea Party as both a manifestation of strong citizen participation, which is a positive aspect of democracy, and exhibiting authoritarian tendencies, which is generally considered not so great, anti-democratic. How can these seemingly contradictory characteristics coexist within the same movement, in your opinion?
Excellent. Okay, let's hear the next question from Eilat. We'll again gather three and then hear, Theda, your responses. Eilat.
Hi. You emphasize in the talk that women were the most active organization on the left and and the right. Do you have any thought on what it said about the political landscape that that even on the right, which is politically dominated by men, were intended to be organized of group meetings?
And Yam.
You mentioned the generational disconnect on the resistance side. How do young people on the left see voting as a way to achieve political change? And does this understanding differ from that of the older generation? And I would like to focus this question about the choice of young people to be participants in state structures.
In government, you mean?
Yeah, like types of government, like local government and district and things that are from top down, and to choose to be part of that.
Yeah, we just this week had local elections in Israel, even in the war, and I'm sure that's part of the motivation of the question, right?
Yeah, I mean, to start with that last one, I do think that people on the Democratic and liberal side of the U.S. spectrum have been very focused on the presidency for decades. Also focused on taking things to the courts and taking them to the Supreme Court. These are political opportunity structures that are shifting, to put it mildly, and therefore there has been renewed interest in doing something that really pays off in U.S. politics, which is start at the local level and move up, do some focusing on the states and on Congress, not just the presidency. So in general, I would say recent resistance movements have increased the participation of everybody from older women to younger people. Particularly the gun protests, in the case of the young people, have brought some young politicians to the fore. And so that is a real change. And of course, this is something that is likely to continue, because although the learning curve is slow, it's brutal. Taking things to the courts is not going to be a good move for people on the left in the United States, because an ideological right-wing movement has taken over our Supreme Court, period. It's just the way it is. The women on the right, if you look through all of American history at voluntary citizen organizing, which has been a powerful force in the United States, probably more so than in almost any other country in the world from the 19th century on, even in male-led, officially male-led or male-exclusive groups, there were female auxiliaries. And the women were doing a lot of the organizing of the dinners and the events. When I visited tea parties in person, I often saw either a male leader or a male and female leader, but the people who were setting up the tables, who were making the food, who were doing the arranging were women. And I don't think the question we should be asking is, why were women doing those things? It would be, how could it be otherwise? That's always the way it is. What's a little bit unusual about the resistance to Trump is that women have been more active in the formal leadership, But even in some of the Tea Parties, there were actual women who were at the head of the room during the meetings. It's just when you got to the national cameras, the Tea Party people were almost always male spokespeople. So heavily at the ranks of the most visible national leaders and those who told pollsters they were sympathizers, they were men, because people on the right in the United States are disproportionately men in this era. But actual volunteer organizing is the active minority, and they are always reliant on women's commitment to make things happen without pay. And then authoritarianism and participation. Here's what I tell my students always, no matter what we're studying. Get over the idea that all good things go together. One of the functions of research is to be aware of the fact that very contradictory things may be happening at the same time. And I remember very clearly when I first came back from the field doing that research on the grassroots Tea Parties, and I stood in front of a Harvard audience who, as one of my Tea Party informants said, "Where you come from," she said, "they think we're a bunch of uneducated rednecks." Well, what was I going to say to that? The only thing I could say was not all of us think that way. And when I went back to Harvard and reported that this was genuine grassroots organizing, this was not the Koch brothers creating an illusion. Koch brothers, a lot of these groups didn't even know who the Koch brothers were. And they weren't interested in being controlled by anybody. They were funding their operations the way American church groups do, by people putting things in a plate. I think that it was a wave of citizen participation. It shocked and remade the Republican Party. Groups of Tea Partiers would arrive at a local Republican county meeting and kick the business types out of the room, follow the constitutional procedures, and change the leadership. They were a much more popular participatory movement, and so are Trump people. Not so much participatory, they more kind of adore him and let him do the participating. But it's the same thing. They've been activated, in many cases, non-voters. So that's democratic. There's no other way to put it. When Jane Mansbridge asked me that question, I said, look, it's democratic, small d. But at the same time, they're intolerant. They're angry. They hate outsiders. They're not willing to reach out. And that's not democratic. And those two things go together. And the whole room at Harvard fell silent when I said that. Nobody had anything to say. All I can say is my job as a researcher is to report it like it is. Not like I wish it was.
Thanks, Theda. And you're doing that in the chapter and also here. You know, this final comment, you said, get over the fact that all good things go together, speaks to one of the things we loved about reading the chapter is the complexity of the arguments, right? That you would sort of want to have it wrapped up in a bow. And when we do serious empirical research, this chapter and your other work shows that's not always the case.
No.
So thanks for Theda for joining us. Thanks to our panelists and participants for asking such great questions. And we look forward to seeing you all again in our second semester webinar series. We have here, for those who've joined us live, a bit of a sneak preview to our second semester. Starting in June, we have Professor André Blais from the University of Montreal. In May is Andre. In June is Professor Rachel Gibson, who's a PI of an ARC advanced grant. She'll be speaking on online political influencers. And in July, we'll have Hari Han from Johns Hopkins speaking on organizing and democracy. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again in the next semester.
So there's more now.